I'm very pleased to be here with you tonight to talk to you about conserving land birds at risk in managed forests. And the emphasis of this talk will be on 3 species at risk: the Canada Warbler, olive-sided flycatcher, and rusty blackbird, and the region of Unama'ki. I'm a retired professor at Dalhousie University, and the project I'll be talking to you about today is one that I've been working on since 2021. And I'm really pleased to be able to talk about it. This is the first time I've presented some of our preliminary results to the public. So I'm just want to tell you how I'm going to approach this talk. First, I'll give you a little bit of an introduction to why we should care about forest birds and their conservation. Then I'll tell you what the rationale behind the current project is, the goal and objective. And it's really focused on trying to test beneficial management practices for landbird species at risk in Nova Scotia. So we'll have an introduction to what are beneficial management practices, and we'll look at how the draft BMPs, or beneficial management practices, that we're using came about. Then we're going to focus in on the 3 focal species. I'll tell you how to identify them, some of the key bits of their nesting and foraging habitat ecology that is relevant to trying to conserve their habitat with BMPs. And then we'll also look at what is in the draft BMPs and what we mean by draft BMPs. Then we'll look at how we conducted our field work for the BMP trials. I'll tell you how we selected our sites and the field protocols we used to collect our data. And then I will be going through examples of 3 BMP trials that are in progress at PHP sites in Unama'ki. I'll briefly mention one of the studies that we are involved in currently to make the BMPs more specific to the situation in Nova Scotia forests. And at the end, I'd like to present some ideas about possible strategies for applying BMPs and forest bird in general, forest bird conservation in general, on private working lands. So why should we care about birds and other biodiversity? Well, this is an important study that you've probably all heard about, that was published in 2019, where they presented the analyses of data for North America from the beginning of the breeding bird survey. Basically 1970 is when people started actually monitoring songbirds. And what they found is that since then we have lost, and this was in 2019, so I'm sure it's more now, almost 3 billion birds. And some of the groups that have had the most extreme losses are the birds of boreal forests, aerial insectivores, things like swallows and swifts and flycatchers. These are birds that eat flying insects, and migratory birds. And so most of the birds that we have here in Nova Scotia are migratory birds. We have many aerial insectivores that are either declining or already at risk. And especially in Cape Breton, you have more boreal forest birds. And this bird here, the evening grosbeak, huge beak, is one of the species that is now at risk. And it's still relatively common in Cape Breton. So, you know, why are we seeing these declines in bird populations? Well, last year, a study was published in Nature by Matt Betts and colleagues that showed that really strong evidence that it's forest degradation that's driving widespread population declines of forest birds through degradation of the habitat, loss of the kind of habitat that a particular species needs. In this little figure here on the bottom of the graph, you can see that there's actually the amount of forest and the region was basically the Maritimes. The amount of forest is actually increased, but the actual habitat for a lot of species has decreased, and that's the other colored lines that you see here going down. And these are birds of mature forest. So what they showed was that, well, actually, this is something everybody is pretty aware of, that habitat degradation, which has happened through intensive forestry over the last many decades, has led to an overall younger landscape of less diverse and structurally simpler forests. And even though the amount of forest overall has increased, the habitat for most forest bird species has actually declined. And these are especially birds that require mature forest. So this study showed that the populations of each species closely tracked the amount of habitat that was available through time. Therefore, the loss of habitat for that particular species explained its decline. And they also showed that the bird species of mature forests are the ones that lost the most habitat and had the steepest population declines. So, you know, it's really important that we start looking at how what we're doing to forests is affecting the birds and looking at ways that we might do things better. So these are the 3 species at risk that we're focusing on this evening, and that I've been working on since 2010, the Canada Warbler, the olive-sided flycatcher, and rusty blackbird. They're all listed under the Species at Risk Act and is the Federal Species at Risk Act, or SARA, and they're also listed under the Nova Scotia Endangered Species Act. And you can see that you know, endangered is a higher level of threat than threatened is a higher level of threat than special concern. So if you look over on the right side, you can see that in Nova Scotia, all 3 of these species have a much higher at risk level in Nova Scotia than in the rest of its range. So the rationale behind my project is really to figure out how can we help recover these SAR bird populations, these species at risk. And really, you know, it comes down to these populations having access to quality breeding habitat. That's good habitat, that's habitat that stays on the landscape, that's consistent. These are all birds that come back to the same exact spot year after year. So being able to come back to their territory is important. And we know from studies that various people have been doing in Nova Scotia over the last 15 years that the populations of these species are really dispersed across working forest landscapes. There's no way that you can recover these species just with protected areas. Therefore, it's really important to start focusing on conservation of breeding habitat within working forests. So sort of the idea for this project came to me when I was doing field work and, you know, noticing that, you know, these 3 species are, you know, using managed forest landscapes, and they seem to be compatible with forestry, and yet it's also possible for forestry practices to eliminate their habitat. So I decided that I wanted to try to work together with the forestry community to find solutions that will both benefit both the birds and forestry. So the main objective of the project is to develop and test, and to do this in a collaborative and iterative way, a set of operational guidelines for best management practices, or BMPs for short, for land bird species at risk, or SAR for short, in Nova Scotia. So beneficial management practices are voluntary. They're practices that are aimed at reducing the risk and avoiding the harm to a target while you're carrying out activities that can impact the target or its habitat. So in this case, the target might be SAR birds or mature forest birds that are declining but aren't yet listed as an at-risk species. In the context of forestry, BMPs can help landowners and forestry operators integrate the maintenance or creation of key habitat features for successful breeding of a species at risk or for other forest birds that are conservation priorities, and to actually incorporate consideration for these birds into forest management planning and forestry operations. Now, there has been quite a lot of BMP type projects being developed in North America, south of the border. And this is one that really stands out for me is what the Maine Audubon has put together for, in this particular, over on the right side, Forestry for Maine Birds, a guidebook for foresters managing with birds in mind. And so these are just 4 examples of things that would be considered like a beneficial management practice that would, that's not geared at a particular species, but geared at promoting the kind of habitat that most of our mature forest species need. So, for example, working at the stand level, you're encouraging vertical and horizontal structural diversity. That's going to promote medium to high density understory, midstory, and overstory cover. So each bird species will tend to have a particular part of the forest stand that they're using. And so if that particular element is missing, they're not going to be in the stand. Another BMP would be promoting structural diversity by fostering softwood inclusions in hardwood stands, or the reverse, fostering hardwood inclusion in softwood stands that creates diversity that promotes diversity in the birds that are able to use the stand. In a lot of younger forest, they haven't broken up with canopy gaps. And so creating canopy gaps can be helpful for encouraging certain species. And then, of course, retaining and even recruiting making snags in decaying trees where it's operationally safe to do so is always a good thing. There just doesn't seem to be enough deadwood in the forest standing or lying deadwood. So that's sort of some ideas about what beneficial management practices can be. I wanted to mention that birds and their nests are protected by law under Canada's Migratory Bird Convention Act. And what this means is that birds, their nests, their eggs, and nestlings have legal protection from destruction, whether it's purposeful or accidental. This applies to all native species, whether they're migratory or resident. They don't have to migrate to be protected. You might wonder, well, should I be out there searching for nests before I do any silviculture in a stand? Well, Environment and Climate Change Canada recommend that you not do that, not to search for nests, but instead, if you want to know what birds are probably breeding there, is to use singing bird surveys. Why is that? Because you're unlikely to find the nest of most birds. You have a higher risk of disturbing it than finding it. And the exception are things like cavity nesters, woodpeckers, ducks and nuthatches that nest in cavities. It's relatively easy to find. So yes, it is definitely worth looking for those. And so one of the most basic BMPs, if you're thinking about birds and forests, is to avoid harvesting during the nesting season. So to do that, Environment and Climate Change Canada recommend consulting nesting calendars when you're planning activities. So the URL for the nesting calendar query tool, which you can look up a particular species in a particular region, is at this URL here. And but Cape Breton is in nesting zone C3, so you would plug that in, and then the species that you're interested in, you would plug in. And if you do that for what's online currently, these are the dates that come up. Rusty Blackbird, May 5th to July 12th, Canada Warbler, May 27th to July 24th, all-sided Flycatcher, June 3rd to August 10th. But these are dates that were collected over a long period of time, and with climate change now and birds arriving and starting to breed earlier, they're probably the start dates are probably shifting quite a bit earlier. So there are BMPs that have been developed for forestry operations in other regions. And these are two here. One for the Rusty Blackbird, which was developed and primarily based on long-term studies of dense populations in northern New Hampshire. And the other for Canada Warbler, which was primarily developed from long-term studies in New Hampshire and then applied to the Atlantic Northern Forest of Canada. There was no such thing for the olive-sided flycatcher. So for Nova Scotia, we have this new series. They're called the Nova Scotia Beneficial Management Practice Series. They are 2-page fact sheets for a specific SAR, and the plan is to have these for every single SAR in Nova Scotia in two contexts. One is forestry and one is agriculture. So Katie McLean has been leading the development of these. They are based on literature review and local knowledge, local experts. The ones that I'm working with for my 3 species were approved by DNRR and ECCC for use as working drafts for this project. So they're saying, yes, let's try them out, and we'll see how effective they are before making any further recommendations about how they might be incorporated into more structured programs. So we also distributed these to forestry professionals and the public starting in June 2021. So if you are on one of the Woodlot Association lists, you probably got a copy. So briefly, what they have on the first page is information about how to identify the bird, how to identify the habitat, what are the threats it faces, and then the beneficial management practices are shown here in this panel. And so this is basically a list of various things you can do that will promote or conserve habitat for that particular species. And then we also have information about how to report sightings and where to go to learn more information. So we're basically, for my project, we're using these how you can help beneficial practices and trying to operationalize them. So if we look at our 3 focal species, these are known to be associated with forested wetlands, wet forest, forest wetland complexes in Nova Scotia. Therefore, it's recommended that you avoid silvicultural practices during the breeding season. Well, that would really be true for any species that you're interested in conserving. To avoid pesticides that negatively impact non-pest insect populations, because these birds all eat just insects during the breeding season, and that's what they feed to the young. To avoid activities that will alter wetland hydrology. If one's going to harvest, to do so on frozen ground, but better to avoid harvesting and road building in wetlands, and to leave a buffer around wetlands and wet forest. So let's let's have a quick look at how to identify the species. So the Canada warbler, the males and females look a little bit different. The males are much brighter, more colorful. They've got a yellow eye ring and a yellow lore. That's a little space between their eye and their bill. They have a distinctive black necklace. So if you get a front view of the bird, that's quite obvious. They're yellow all underneath, except under their tail, they're white, and they have bluish-gray upper parts. The females just look like a pale version of the male, and they're really, really secretive and hard to see. And this is what they sound like. So a jumble of notes given very, very quickly. And so the males sing and the females give sort of a dull chip. Canada warblers primarily inhabit mixed wood swamps in Nova Scotia. They need a very complicated, complex habitat. They need a semi-open tree canopy. They need to have emergent trees for display purposes. So these are trees that will stand up above the canopy. They need tall shrubs, 2 to 5 meters high, with lots of stem density, and then also dense foliage under 2 meters. And cinnamon fern is something that's quite common in their habitat. And they need a really complex, messy floor, like you can see over in the lower right photo. And that's because they nest on or near the ground, so they need well-concealed sites to build their nest in. So usually there's lots of vegetation around the nest. The nests are really hard to find. They may place a nest, for example, on a little hummock from a tree root that is tipped over. And their territories are sort of a typical songbird, small songbird size, about a 1 hectare. And usually their entire territory is wet forest. The draft BMPs for the Canada warbler, these are based on long-term studies in New Hampshire, and they are basically trying to conserve the elements that the bird needs for foraging and nesting. So to get that complex habitat, they recommend using an uneven age management system. We want at least 3 well-defined age classes. Maintaining a mixture of hardwoods and softwoods is a good idea. Limiting hardwood herbicide use is important because without the shrub layer, they can't use the habitat. They're also sensitive to edge, so minimizing the amount of edge that you create when you're harvesting is a good idea. And also, minimizing travel within the harvest blocks and maximizing trail spacing and machine reach. And because the males have to go up in tall trees to look out and sing and look out over their territory, they need a certain number of trees that will stand up above the rest of the canopy. And so the studies in New Hampshire have figured out exactly what that should be. Also, because they need this complex ground, one should minimize the compaction of soil and removal of ground vegetation, moss cover, down woody debris, stumps, hummocks, and root masses of ferns and trees, all these things that make the ground very, very difficult to walk through. And one way to promote that is to leave tree tops and limbs on site because this will enhance woody debris and forest floor structure. This is the olive-sided flycatcher. Males and females look the same. They are sort of a medium-sized bird that has a very distinctive dark vest with a light belly. They have really short legs, no wing bars. So most flycatchers have wing bars. Those are little sort of horizontal stripes, 1 or 2 stripes across the wing here. Their head is a very distinctive sort of squarish shape, and their tail is quite short. So both males and females have calls that sound like this. And the male only has this song, which sounds like pip 3 beers or quick 3 beer. So it's really quite easy to learn to identify the song of that species. So the olive-sided flycatcher is a sallying insectivore, which means it flies out from a perch to capture bees and other large flying insects, and then it returns to a perch in order to eat it. And so that figures prominently into the structure of the habitat that it needs. It needs to be able to perch on the tops of trees and snags, and it needs space to fly out around those treetops in order to catch insects. In Nova Scotia, it breeds mostly in black spruce swamps and bogs. But you'll also find it on clear-cut edges if you've got mature red and black spruce and of sort of the right age and spatial pattern. It needs tall snags and residual live trees in order to hunt from. It's the only flycatcher in North America that has only one mode of foraging, and that's simply to do the sallying. So because of that, it needs a relatively open canopy, and a good habitat seems to have ericaceous shrub layer, things like lambkill and blueberry. These flowering plants have a lot of bees, and that's one of their favorite foods. They have really big territories, 15 to 20, to even up to 40 hectares. They have high site fidelity, which means they're coming back to the same territory year after year. They sing as well as forage from these prominent perches near or at the top of a conifer or the top of a snag. So they're actually one of the easier birds to spot. If you hear one, it's usually possible to find it. It nests in clumps of large mature conifers. Here's a nest here. Here's a nest here. Their nests are placed away from the trunk, probably to prevent things like red squirrels from finding their nest easily. And I was convinced there was a nest in this tree, but I could never find it. It's a large black spruce on the edge of a large wetland. So the drop BMPs for the olive-sided flycatcher are obviously geared to the kind of habitat it needs. Of all of the BMPs that I've seen so far, this is the one that has the least specificity in terms of what to retain. But these are basically what the BMPs have, leave a 50-meter tree buffer in areas where red or black spruce is surrounding bogs or swamps or other freshwater wetlands or meadows. To use uneven age forest management systems where you're leaving clumps of tall trees in an area that's being harvested, especially if it's conifer stands, because that's basically what they're using for perch sites and nest sites. And they're also spending a lot of their time foraging from the tops of snags, and so those are really important to leave if possible. The rusty blackbird is, again, a medium-sized bird, a bit larger than the flycatcher. In the breeding season, the male is a glossy black, the female is a charcoal gray. If you saw the birds today, and there are a few birds that are wintering at feeders around Nova Scotia this winter, you would see that the tips of their feathers are rusty colored, and that's what gives them their name, the rusty blackbird. But they will molt, or those feathers will wear off by the time they start to breed, and then they become glossy black. So the male sings from the tops of trees, but they're nesting in small, low, dense conifers. They have pale eyes, a thin bill, a plump body, and a medium-length tail. And the species that it's most likely confused with is a common grackle. Their songs, it's primarily the male that sings, although females do occasionally sing. And the males have songs, basically two song types, one of a lower pitch and one of a higher pitch. The lower pitch is about 4.5 kilohertz, the higher pitch at 5 kilohertz, and they sound like this. Whoops. Not the prettiest sound. These birds nest in conifer-dominated and mixed forest landscapes that are low slope with lots of wetlands and streams running through them. Beaver ponds beaver modified landscapes are really good for rusty blackbirds. They also use the edges of streams and lakes if they're quite shallow and muddy, and bogs and fens. These birds, again, the species also has high site fidelity, returning to the same place, and even larger home ranges than the flycatcher. Their home ranges can be 20 to 60 hectares. They can range over a distance of 1 kilometer or more within a day to forage. But they stay in their home range. It's just quite large. They feed on aquatic invertebrates in shallow water, mud or under leaf litter, and they nest starting in April, and they build their nests in dense clumps of young or stunted conifers. They're usually close to or over shallow water. There's a nest in this young tree here, I think is a fir. There was a nest in this black spruce here. There was a nest in this clump of black spruce here. This is in Eastern Cape Breton, and somewhere around this beaver pond here. So the draft BMPs for this species are also based on long-term studies in New Hampshire. They have some very, very specific recommendations. I haven't put them all on the slide here. But one is leaving a tree buffer around all wetlands and streams, retaining mature live trees and snags dispersed and in clumps for perch sites. And if you know that a bird has nested in the site, to not disturb that site, because they do come back and use the same site year after year. Retaining 50% of overstory and mature shade intolerant softwood stands is recommended. And in terms of planting to benefit this bird in northern New Hampshire, at any rate, if they find that there's less than 60% advanced regeneration, they recommend planting native softwood species at a particular density of 1,800 to 2,500 stems per hectare. Okay. I'm not sure what that would look like, but the foresters on this webinar should know. Okay, so now we're going. And I just wanted to mention before we get into this is that we have been able to find sites to apply BMPs for Canada Warbler and olive-sided flycatcher, but it was very difficult to find rusty blackbirds, so we don't actually have any BMPs specific to that species that we're working on. Okay, so how did we go about doing our project? Well, selecting the test sites was the first step. So we got maps of approved harvest blocks from our forestry partners, and our partners are PHP, Medway Community Forest Co-op, and West 4. So we got their harvest block maps, and we overlaid those with known SAR occurrences from the ACDC database, the Atlantic Canada Conservation Data Center, which compiled data for species at risk. We overlaid existing SAR habitat models. Shannon Bale had created models for the province of Nova Scotia for these 3 species. We also looked at, where are the wetlands, and we used wet areas mapping to look at predicted areas that were wet. We used the forest resource inventory, and we also used Google Earth satellite images. So we're trying to find, well, in some cases, if we only had a few sites, we would sample those sites. But for example, I think PHP gave us about 100 sites or more, and so we had to prioritize which sites we were going to go to. So what we did was in order to do the bird surveys, we targeted the most promising parts, the most promising blocks and the most promising parts of blocks. And so we were looking at areas of wet forest or near wet forest or near wetlands. We did our surveys in 2021. We sent our results back to the forestry partners saying these are the SARs we found, giving them the locations. And then they sent back a list of sites that had our SAR either on where we had found them on the site or adjacent to the site. And that the blocks were also likely to be harvested over the fall of 2023 or fall of 2022, winter 2023. When we went looking for the species at risk, what we would do is first we would look for them, and if we could not find them singing spontaneously, usually you don't see a bird unless you hear it first. We used 30 seconds of playback of songs and calls of that species, which has been shown to increase the likelihood that you're going to detect a species if it's actually there. When we found a species at risk, we estimated its exact location by adjusting the location of the observer for the distance and direction to the bird. And we also deployed what are called autonomous recording units, or ARUs, to detect additional SAR that we might have missed when we were there. So in the middle here, you can see an ARU called the audio moth. These are only about 10 centimeters across. You program them. They have an SD card inside. They record when you want them to. Put them on a tree, and then you come back a week, 2 weeks, a month later, pick them up, and then you analyze the recordings for what SAR are present. It's actually a pretty time-consuming process. In addition to the harvest blocks, we also monitored SAR at a few control sites where no harvests were planned, so that we know, if for some reason if we lose birds from the BMP sites, we want to be able to say, well, what would be the rate of losing birds in a site that isn't being harvested? And this is just an example of one of the control sites. We have a Canada Warbler site and an olive-sided flycatcher site at the Otter Ponds Demonstration Forest. The picture on the left shows these tall red spruce that were really sort of just sticking up, and they apparently pretty much all of them blew over during the Hurricane Fiona last fall. So it'll be interesting to see, even though it wasn't a harvest site, it was heavily impacted. So this map shows the a number of the survey sites that we visited in 2021. It happens to show where we had put the ARUs. So mostly they are on our Crown Land partner sites, but also on the few on private lands and the Otter Ponds demonstration forest, which is Crown Land as well. So after we sent our survey information to the partners, they sent back a list of sites that they thought they could work on this year, and that's shown here. And today I'll be speaking about a site here, a site here, a site here in Cape Breton, or Unama'ki. So in 2021, we basically tried to visit as many sites as we could, find as many birds as we could, because we didn't know which sites were actually going to be harvested within the time frame of the study. Now that we had this list of sites, we did intensive surveys of those sites because we wanted to find the birds if they were there. So we went back May, June, and July, and we spent time trying to map out the territories of the birds rather than just saying, okay, there is a SAR at the site. And so we did that using playback, which is a standard technique for mapping territories. And we also used more autonomous recording units to get evidence of additional SAR activity. So if you look at the BMPs, the draft BMPs, which I just have a copy of on the right side of the slide here, they really are sort of general for they're designed for general use, something that somebody can pick up and say, okay, well, if I'm doing some harvesting or taking some firewood out, you know, and I'm worried about Canada warbler, then I can do these things. However, so they're written to be used without knowledge of SAR presence. They don't require that you know that there's Canada warbler on your site to do that. It's basically recommendations for encouraging habitat for a particular SAR. But I felt it was important to be testing the BMPs at sites with known SAR so that we can determine the effect of that BMP on a particular bird or territory. So basically, I went through, a lot of work to try to document that the birds were actually there and where they were, and then designed the recommended BMP operational guidelines around those particular locations of the birds. So the protocol that I'm going to describe in the next couple of slides, when I show you examples of the sites, 3 sites in Unama'ki, these were developed through discussions with PHP and DNRR Eastern Region IRM team, so particularly Terry Power, and these resulted in the protocols that we ended up using. This is a site called McIntyre Mountain, and the little yellow diamonds are places where we found Canada warblers. They're not all different individuals, but they're clumps of symbols would be a particular territory. The whitish areas are the actual harvest blocks. And the green, the sort of the brighter aqua colors are the mapped wetlands. These are bogs that were actually mapped in the forest inventory. And then the other thing I have on this map is depth to water table. where the yellower or mustard color is showing where the water is predicted to be less than 10 centimeters from the surface, and the violet color is where it's predicted to be less than 50 centimeters from the surface. So what I wanted to point out here is that Canada warblers are usually found in wet forest or near wetlands. And one of the things I learned in looking at the harvest, the harvest maps in general, of the maps of the harvest blocks, is they tended to avoid wetlands. They were often drawn to exclude wetlands, which is obviously the case here. However, there are wet areas along the edge and just outside of the harvest block that the Canada warblers are using. So they're using this area primarily between the wetlands and the upland forest. But there's they often will go up into the edge of the upland forest. I also wanted to point out on the left side, this is a drone image. My husband's a drone pilot, and he was participating in my project by flying his drone over the sites. And we'll be using the drone to try to measure what the habitat was before and after the harvest prescription was applied. Okay, so you see where the Canada warblers are. And now I'm going to show you how we went about figuring out how can we apply the BMPs here, because you can't really take that list of BMPs that's in the 2-page fact sheet and simply apply it to this. You have to think about, what makes sense. So what we came up with was that around each of the locations where the bird was sighted, and here different birds are identified by different numbers. So you can see there are up to 10, looks like 10 different singing male Canada warblers in this area. For scale, the blue circles are 100 meters, actually 200 meters across. And because they have a radius of 100 meters. The small beige circles are no harvest or no treat buffers around those locations. So we decided we wouldn't the harvest would avoid the actual spot where the bird was. And then in this area around it, so that would be from 25 to 100 meters from that point, that the harvest BMPs would be applied. And so that's what you see over here on the right side. So we recommended retaining trees for use as song perches, at least 12 standing trees per hectare, individually or in small clumps, 4.5 meters apart and at least 3 meters above the subcanopy. I believe that PHP said that their particular prescription for the site would leave that anyway. Secondly, minimizing disturbance to ground vegetation and the woody material and so forth on the ground. They agreed to leave treetops and limbs on site to enhance the woody debris and forest floor structure. Avoid the use of pesticides and herbicides. And another thing that we realized was that, if you're harvesting in the blue area and you're bringing your harvester in, you want to make sure it stays, the harvester doesn't get you're not making tracks within the area that you're trying to not disturb. So we decided that the way to do that was to locate the trails a distance from the no harvest buffer edge that corresponds to the boom length of the harvester. we had done a harvest in April in Southwest Nova Scotia, and there wasn't enough thought given to where the trails were placed, and they actually ended up being placed in the buffer. So this is another site. It had 7 singing Canada warblers, and we made similar BMP recommendations for this site. This is the Whites Lake site between Port Hawkesbury and St. Peter's. This was interesting because, usually when we have Canada warblers, you can tell that the forest is wet because the depth to water table layer will overlap it. But in this case, the sites were actually wet, but they don't show up as wet on the wet areas mapping, and I'm not sure why. But so again, the yellow dots are Canada warblers, the beige dots are the no harvest buffers, and then the blue are the areas where the harvesting should follow those BMP prescriptions. And the third site is at River Tillard, and this is an example of a site that had both olive-sided flycatchers and Canada warblers. And you can see the olive-sided flycatchers are in green circles, the Canada warblers are in yellow circles, and we also, there's some blue circles there, that we also found common nighthawks in the more open areas in the north part. And you can see, again, the area is surrounded by mapped wetlands, and there's additional predicted wetland coming out around there. So we did a similar thing for the Canada Warbler BMP recommendations. The recommendations on the right side of this slide are identical to what I showed you before. So it's just this sort of the same process applied to another site. And for the olive-sided flycatchers, this time the no harvest buffers they're still beige, but now the area where the BMPs will be applied are green, shown as green, 20 to 100 meters around the bird locations. Okay, so these are the BMPs we suggested for the olive-sided flycatcher at the site: to use uneven aged forest management systems where possible, to leave clumps of tall trees, especially with mature black spruce. And that's because the birds are using the mature black spruce clumps to build their nests and also to hunt from the tops of the trees. Third, to leave all snags that do not pose a safety threat. Taller snags are used as hunting perches by this bird, and avoiding the use of pesticides and herbicides, especially for bees, because they're a preferred food of this species. If you herbicide, so the pesticides would kill the bees and the herbicides would kill their food. So one thing I noticed is that the BMPs for the olive-sided flycatcher aren't really as specific as they could be. I don't think anyone has prepared really specific ones for this species, and there hasn't been as much work done on this species in the eastern part of North America. So what we did, and we're still analyzing the data, but you see these pink strips. These are transects, belt transects. We put these in 16 olive-sided flycatcher territories. So we actually put 3 of them in the River Tillard site. But we have samples from across Nova Scotia. And what we did was along a 50-meter line, extending 5 meters on either side of the line, we mapped every single snag and tree, measured the distance from the line, the perpendicular distance from the main line. We recorded the species, the height, the DBH, and the health or decay class. And this is for everything that was over 5 centimeters in DBH and 5 meters tall. We recorded, recorded understory vegetation information in 2.5 meter sections. So every two meters as we walked along the transect, we estimated what was the ground vegetation, low shrub layer, like basically anything under 5 meters. What were the main species? What were their heights? What were their covers? So in terms of the trees and snags, we produced these maps of the trees along the transect, and this is a drone image of the transect. And the drone images we have are super high resolution, 2.6 centimeters resolution. And so I've got some students trying to get these maps of the trees georeferenced on the site. This is becoming this is much harder than I thought it would be. But we're also working on calculating and stand metrics from the drone images, and then also LiDAR data for the same areas. And this is just a quick summary of what we have found so far for the trees and snags in those 16 olive-sided flycatcher plots. So we have quite a lot of snags, about a quarter of all of the trees or more are dead on the sites. Actually, yeah, 31% of the trees and snags are snags. Their average DBH is quite similar. Average height is taller for the trees than the snags because they've been broken off. And so we have, spruce is the most common tree that we're finding, mostly black spruce, but also red. Fir, the next common tree, and some pines, mostly in southwestern Nova Scotia, and hardwoods, and most of the hardwoods are red maple. So and if you look at the health class of the trees, this is a histogram showing that of all of the trees that were measured, that the health class 2 was the most common one, and that's where 25 to 50% of the crown has been affected by various things. So they're not in the best of shape. So we're conducting ongoing analyses to determine the pattern of tree clumping and spacing, which I think is going to be really important because it's relevant to the nesting and foraging habitat of the birds. And I think the species can tolerate quite a bit of open space as long as you leave the right kinds of clumps. So we're trying to figure that out. So next summer, what we're planning to do is to document the effectiveness of the BMPs that have been applied. So we want to know, we're going to go back, do the same surveys. We want to know, are those birds still there? Are they using the same area? And if they are, then that would be evidence that the BMPs worked to conserve the habitat elements that they need for nesting and foraging. I also hope to obtain post-harvest stand data from our partners, either from DNRR or from the forestry companies. And we also plan to fly the drone over the sites again so that we'll have drone photos that can be used to document the habitat after the harvesting, and then using forest metrics that we get from the drone imagery, we can compare the data from the pre and the post harvest to see what was changed and where. So I wanted to just mention that there are other species of star in the managed forests of Unama'ki. The eastern wood pewee is a species of mature mixed wood upland forest, and there are draft BMPs available for it. The common nighthawk is a species that likes that nests in sparsely vegetated sites. There are BMPs for it, and we did find them in quite a few of our sites. And the evening grosbeak is another SAR, but we don't have BMPs for them. There's not enough research on them. So in closing, I wanted to give you some thoughts about, how to incorporate landbird conservation and BMPs into private woodlot management. And so there are sort of different ways you could go about it. If you don't have any information about whether there are SAR on your woodlot, there are still things you could do. And some of these include, well, they would include things in the BMP documents. You could apply a buffer, a 50-meter buffer around any wetland or wet forest streams, and possibly areas where there's a water table within half a meter of the surface, because that basically means the area is wet. You could use uneven age management techniques to increase the structural diversity of stands, and other ecological forestry techniques specific to stand types. So I'm quite encouraged with the new forestry guidelines for trying to encourage a more multi-aged, more diverse forest. You could also plan to apply BMPs for species that are most likely to be present based on the kinds of stands and habitats that you have at your site. If you're working with somebody like Peter Burchill, then you can probably get access to SAR location information from the ACCDC. You could use GIS layers, and you could also use habitat models. These are habitat suitability models that predict where SAR habitat would be found. And I recently did a project for UNIR for the priority place, modeling habitat for 6 species. And this is just a quick look at the models that we produced for the Bredor Lakes watershed for across the top, the 6 species. And we also did combined models. We're looking at all 6 species, the 3 wetland SAR that we talked about today, and then the 3 wet forest SAR that we talked about today, and then the wetland SAR include a common nighthawk because it has an association with wetlands. And on these pictures, so they're a suitability model where the red is the highest suitability and the blue is the lowest. And we also have these models for all of Unama'ki. Another thing to think about is how to schedule silvicultural work. How to prioritize what stands get worked on when. Since I've been talking to foresters about BMPs, and one of the BMPs that always comes up is not harvesting during the breeding season. The question I often get is, what if I can't afford to stop harvesting for 2 to 3 months? And not many people can. So my answer to that is, well, then try to do the least harm. And one way to do that is to prioritize sites. And so looking at stands or areas that you're going to work on, that you would prioritize for working on outside of the nesting season, before May and after August. And so these would be sites that have SAR or have SAR habitat. These would be sites that support mature forest birds, which we know are declining, even if they're not listed as at risk. and also sites with wet forest or sites that are adjacent to wetlands, because forested wetlands and more open wetlands are documented to be more productive sites, have more bird species, have more individual birds, and more SAR than upland sites. So that's a really important, easy decision to make, is to try to prioritize not harvesting in near those sites during the breeding season. Okay, so if you're interested in learning more or getting involved in any of these projects, these are some things you can do. You could attend the field trip that we're planning for Saturday, June 17th in the Bedeck area. We've chosen a rain date 1 week later on June 24th. You can contact Peter Burchell at the Cape Breton Private Land Partnership. You can download the draft BMPs. We have them on our Landbirds at Risk website, and they have them on the CBPP website. I think they're also on the Otter Ponds website. You can visit our website to learn more. The website is hosted by the Mercy Togiatic Research Institute, and so is my project email. And I also wanted to mention that with MTRI, I'm helping to develop a new project to incorporate SAR forest bird conservation through BMPs into private woodlot management plans, hoping to start that next year, pending funding. So I have a lot of people to thank for the funding and the help and partnerships in this work. And I wanted to thank you very much for listening.